Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Well, hello again, friends, and you have come to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, episode 62. So, I'm so glad you joined me, and we will be continuing with a Tuesday read. So, let's hop right over to our reading screen. And I will be continuing with Eothen. So, we left off and are picking up on Chapter 8, Lady Hester Stanhope. Beirut, on its landslide, is hemmed in by mountains. There dwell the Druses. Often enough, I saw the ghostly images of the women with their exalted horns stalking through the streets, and I saw, too, in traveling, the affrighted groups of the mountaineers as they fled before me, under the fear that my troop might be a company of income tax commissioners, or a new press gang, enforcing the conscription for Mehmet Ali. But nearly all of my knowledge of these people, except in regard of their mere costume and outward appearance, is drawn from books and dispatches. To these last, I have the honor to refer you. Footnote: the papers laid before Parliament by the Foreign Office in 1840 and 1841. I received hospitable welcome at Beirut from the Europeans as well as from the Syrian Christians, and I soon discovered that in all society the standing topic of interest was an Englishwoman, Lady Hester Stanhope, who lived in an old convent on the Lebanon range, at the distance of about a day's journey from the town. The lady's habit of refusing to see Europeans added the charm of mystery to a character which, even without that aid, was sufficiently distinguished to command attention. Many years of Lady Hester's early womanhood had been passed with Lady Chatham at Burton Pensant, and during that inglorious period of the heroine's life, her commanding character, and, as they would have called it, in the language of those days, her condescending kindness towards my mother's family, had increased in them those strong feelings of respect and attachment which her rank and station alone would have easily won from people of the middle class. You may suppose how deeply the quiet woman in Somersetshire must have been interested when they slowly learned by vague and uncertain tidings that the intrepid girl who had been used to break their vicious horses for them was reigning in sovereignty over the wandering tribes of Western Asia. I know that her name was made almost as familiar to me in my childhood as the name of Robin Crusoe. Both were associated with the spirit of adventure, but whilst the imagined life of the castaway mariner never failed to seem glaringly real, the true story of the Englishwoman ruling over the Arabs always sounded to me like a fable. I never had heard, nor indeed, I believe, had the best of the world ever heard anything like a certain account of the heroine's adventures. All I knew was that in one of the drawers, the delight of my childhood, along with with atta of roses and fragrant wonders of Hindustan, were the letters carefully treasured and trifled presents which I was taught to think valuable because they had come from the queen of the desert, a queen who dwelt in tents and reigned over wandering Arabs. The subject, however, died away, and from the ending of my childhood up to the period of my arrival in the Levant, I had seldom even heard a mentioning of the Lady Hester Stanhope. But now, wherever I went, I was met by the name so familiar in sound, and yet so full of mystery, from the vague fairy tale sort of idea which it brought to my mind. I heard it too connected with fresh wonders, for it was said that the woman was now acknowledged as an inspired being by the people of the mountains, and it was even hinted with horror that she claimed to be more than a prophet. I felt at once that my mother would be sorry to hear that I had been within a day's ride of her early friend without offering to see her, and I therefore dispatched a letter to the recluse, mentioning the maiden name of my mother, whose marriage was subsequent to Lady Hester's departure, and saying that if there existed on the part of her ladyship any wish to hear of her old Somersetshire acquaintance, I should make a point of visiting her. My letter was sent by a foot messenger who was to take an unlimited time for his journey, so that it was not, I think, until either the third or fourth day that the answer arrived. A couple of horsemen covered with mud suddenly dashed into the little port of the Locanda, in which I was staying, bearing themselves as ostentatiously as though they were carrying a cartel from the devil to the angel Michael. One of these, the other being his attendant, was an Italian by birth, though now completely orientalized, who lived in my lady's establishment as a doctor nominally, but practically as an upper servant. He presented me a very kind and appropriate letter of invitation. It happened that I was rather unwell at this time, so that I named a more distant day for my visit than I should otherwise have done, and after all I did not start at the time fixed, whilst still remaining at Beirut. I received another letter from Lady Hester. This I will give you, for it shows that whatever the eccentricities of the writer may have been, she could at least be thoughtful and courteous. Sir, I hope I shall be disappointed in seeing you on Wednesday, for the late rains have rendered the river Damour, if not dangerous, at least very unpleasant to pass for a person who has been lately indisposed. For if the animal swims, you would be immersed in the waters. The weather will probably change after the 21st of the moon, and after a couple of days the roads and the river will be passable. Therefore, I shall expect you either Saturday or Monday. It will be a great satisfaction to me to have an opportunity of inquiring after your mother, who was a sweet, lovely girl when I knew her. Believe me, sir, yours sincerely, Hester Lucy Stanhope. Early one morning I started from Beirut. There are no established relays of horses in Syria, at least not in the line which I took, and you therefore hire your cattle for the whole journey, or at all events for your journey, to some large town. Under these circumstances, you don't, of course, require a functionary empowered to compel the supply of horses, and you can therefore dispense with a Tartar. In other respects, the mode of traveling through Syria differs very little from that which I have described as prevailing in Turkey. I hired my horses and mules for the whole of the journey from Beirut to Jerusalem. The owner of the beasts, he had a couple of fellows under him, was the most dignified member of my party, and he was indeed a magnificent old man, and he was called Sharif, or Holy, a title of honor, which was the privilege of wearing a green turban he well deserved, not only from the blood of the Prophet that glowed in his veins, but from the well-known sanctity of his life, and the length of his blessed beard. Mysseri, of course, still travelled with me, but the Arabic was not one of the 7 languages which he spoke so perfectly, and I was, therefore, obliged to hire another interpreter. I had no difficulty in finding a proper man for the purpose, one Demetrius, or, as he was always called, Demetri, native of Zante, who had been tossed about by fortune in all directions. He spoke the Arabic well, and communicated with me in Italian. The man was a very zealous member of the Greek Church. He had been a tailor. He had a thoroughly Tartar countenance, a countenance so odd and ugly that it expressed all his griefs of body and mind in the most ludicrous manner imaginable. He embellished the natural caricature of his person by suspending about his neck and shoulders and waist quantities of little bundles and bags filled with treasures, which he thought too valuable to be entrusted to the jerking of pack saddles. The mule that fell to his lot on this journey every now and then, forgetting that his rider was a saint, and remembering that he was a tailor, took quite a roll upon the ground, and stretched his limbs calmly and lazily, like a good man awaiting a sermon. Dmitri never got seriously hurt, but the subversion and dislocation of his bundles made him for the moment a sad spectacle of ruin. And when he regained his legs, his wrath with the mule was sure to be very amusing. He always addressed the beast in language implying that he, a Christian and saint, had been personally insulted and oppressed by a Mahometan mule. Dmitri, however, on the whole, proved to be a most able and capital servant. I suspected him of now and then leading me out of my way in order that he might have the opportunity of visiting the shrine of a saint, and on one occasion, as you will see by and by, he was induced by religious motives to commit a gross breach of duty, but putting these pious faults out of the question, and they were faults of the right side, he was always faithful and true to me. I left Sidi, the Sidon of ancient times, on my right, and about an hour, I think, before sunset, began to ascend one of the many low hills of Lebanon. On the summit before me was a broad, gray mass of irregular building, which from its position, as well as from gloomy darkness of its walls, gave the idea of a neglected fortress. It had, in fact, been a convent of great size, and, like most of the religious houses in this part of the world, had been made strong enough for opposing an inert resistance to any mere casual band of assailants, who might be unprovided with regular means of attack. This was the dwelling place of Chatham's fiery granddaughter. The aspect of the first court I entered was such as to keep one in the idea of having to do with a fortress rather than a mere peaceable dwelling place. A number of fierce-looking and ill-clad Albanian soldiers were hanging about the place, inert, and striving as well as they could to bear the curse of tranquillity. 2 or 3 of them were smoking their Chibok, Chibokis, but the rest were lying torpidly upon the flat stones, like the bodies of departed brigands. I rode on to an inner part of the building, and at last, quitting my horses, was conducted through a doorway that led me at once from an open court into an apartment on the ground floor. As I entered, an oriental figure in male costume approached me from the further end of the room, with many and profound bows, but the growing shades of evening prevented me from distinguishing the features of the personage who was receiving me with this solemn welcome. I had always, however, understood that Lady Hester Stanhope wore the male attire, and I began to utter in English the common civilities that seemed to be proper on the commencement of a visit by an uninspired mortal to a renowned prophetess. But the figure which I addressed only bowed so much the more, prostrating itself almost to the ground, but speaking to me never a word. I feebly strived not to be outdone in gestures of respect, but presently my bowing opponent saw the error under which I was acting, and suddenly convinced me that all events I was not yet in the presence of a superhuman being, by declaring that he was far from being milady, and was in fact nothing more or less godlike than the poor doctor who had brought his mistress's letter to Beirut. Lady Hester, in the right spirit of hospitality, now sent and commanded me to repose for a while after the fatigues of my journey, and to dine. The cuisine was of the oriental kind, highly artificial, and, as I thought, very good. I rejoiced too in the wine of the Lebanon. After dinner, the doctor arrived with milady's compliments, and an intimation that she would be happy to receive me if I were so disposed. It had now grown dark, and the rain was falling heavily, so that I got rather wet in following my guide through the open courts that I had to pass in order to reach the presence chamber. At last I was ushered into a small chamber, protected from the draughts of air passing through the doorway, and by a folding screen. Passing this, I came alongside of a common European sofa. There sat the lady prophetess. She rose from her seat very formally, spoke to me in a few words of welcome, pointed to a chair, one already placed exactly opposite to her sofa, at a couple of yards' distance, and remained standing up to the full of her majestic height, perfectly still and motionless, until I had taken my appointed place. She then resumed her seat, not packing herself up, according to the mode of the Orientals, but allowing her feet to rest on the floor or the footstool at the moment of seating herself. She covered her lap with a mass of loose white drapery. It occurred to me at the time that she did this in order to avoid the awkwardness of sitting in manifest trousers under the eye of an European. But I can hardly fancy now that with her wilful nature she would have brooked such a compromise as this. The woman before me had exactly the person of a prophetess, not indeed of the divine Sibyl imagined by Domenichino, so sweetly distracted betwixt love and mystery, but of a good, businesslike, practical prophetess, long used to the exercise of her sacred calling. I have been told by those who knew Lady Hester Stanhope in her youth, that any notion of a resemblance betwixt her and the great Chatham must have been fanciful. But at the time of my seeing her, The large commanding features of the gaunt woman, then 60 years old or more, certainly reminded me of the statesman that lay dying, historically fainting. The death did not occur until long afterwards. That was a footnote. Uh, in the House of Lords, according to Copley's picture, her face was of the most astonishing whiteness. Footnote. I am told in my youth that she was exceedingly sallow. She wore a very large turban, made seemingly of pale cashmere shawls, and so disposed as to conceal her hair. Her dress, from the chin down to the point at which it was concealed by the drapery on her lap, was a mass of white linen, loosely folding, an ecclesiastical sort of affair, more like a surplice than any of those blessed creations which our souls love under the names of dress, and frock, and bodice, and collar, and habit shirt, and sweet chemisette. Such was the outward seeming of the personage that sat before me, and indeed she was almost bound by the fame of her actual achievements, as well as her sublime pretensions, to look a little differently from the rest of womankind. There had been something of grandeur in her career. After the death of Lady Chatham, which happened in 1803, she lived under the roof of her uncle, the second Pitt, and when he resumed the government in 1804, she became the dispenser of such patronage and sole Secretary of State for the Department of Treasury banquets, not having seen the lady until late in her life, when she was fired with spiritual ambition. I can hardly fancy that she could have performed her political duties in the saloons of the minister with much of feminine sweetness and patience. I am told, however, that she managed matters very well indeed. Perhaps it was better for the lofty-minded leader of the house to have his reception rooms guarded by this stately creature than by merely clever and managing woman. It was fitting that the wholesome awe with which he filled the minds of the country gentlemen should be aggravated by the presence of his majestic niece. But in the end was approaching. The son of the Austerlitz showed the Czar madly sliding his splendid army like the weaver's shuttle from his right hand to his left, under the very eyes, the deep gray, watchful eyes of Napoleon. Before night came, the coalition was a vain thing, meet for history in the heart of its great author. When the terrible tidings came to his ears, was wrung with grief, fatal grief. In the bitterness of his despair, he cried out to his niece, and bid her roll up the map of Europe. There was a little more of suffering, and at last, with his swollen tongue, so they say, still muttering something for England, he died by the noblest of all sorrows. Lady Hester, meeting the calamity in her own fierce way, seems to have scorned the poor island that had enough of God's grace to keep the heaven-sent minister alive. I can hardly tell why it should be, but there is a longing for the East, very commonly felt by the proud people when goaded by sorrow. Lady Hester Stanhope obeyed this impulse for some time. I believe she was at Constantinople, and there her magnificence, as well as their near alliance to the late minister, gained her great influence. Afterwards she passed into Syria. The people of that country excited by the achievements of Sir Sidney Smith, had begun to imagine the possibility of their land being occupied by the English. And many of them looked upon Lady Hester as a princess who came to prepare the way for the expected conquest. I don't know it from her own lips, or indeed from any certain authority, but I have been told that she began her connection with the Bedouins by making a large present of money, £500, immense in piastres, to the sheik, whose authority was recognized in the desert between Damascus and Palmyra. The prestige created by the rumors of her high and undefined rank, as well as her wealth and corresponding magnificence, was well sustained by her imperious character and her dauntless bravery. Her influence increased. I never heard anything satisfactory as to the real extent or duration of her sway, but I understood that, for a time at least, she certainly exercised something like sovereignty amongst the wandering tribes, and now that her earthly kingdom had passed away, she strove for spiritual power, and impiously dared, as it was said, to boast some mystic union with the very God of very God. A couple of black slave girls came at a signal, and supplied their mistress, as well as myself, with lighted tujube, pretty much lighted pipes, and coffee. Chibuque, and coffee. The custom of the East sanctions and almost commands some moments of silence whilst you are inhaling the first few breaths of the fragrant pipe. The pause was broken, I think, by my lady, who addressed to me some inquiries respecting my mother, and particularly as to her marriage. But before I had communicated any great amount of family facts, the spirit of the prophetess kindled within her, and presently, though without all the skill of a woman of the world, she shuffled away the subject of poor dear Somersetshire, and bounded onward into the loftier spheres of thought. Sorry for the interruption there. My old acquaintance with some of the 12 enabled me to bear my part, of course a very humble one, in a conversation relative to occult science, Milnes, once spread a report that every gang of gypsies was found upon inquiry to have some last from a place to the westward, and to be about to make the next move in an eastern direction. Either, therefore, they were to be all gathered together towards the rising of the sun by the mysterious finger of Providence, or else they were to resolve, or else they were able. Sorry, my eyes are starting to go wonky a little. Or else they were to revolve round the globe forever and ever. Both of these superstitions were highly gratifying because they were both marvelous, and though the story on which they were founded plainly sprang from the inventive brain of a poet No one had ever been so odiously statistical as to attempt a contradiction of it. I now mentioned the story as a report to Lady Hester Stanhope, and asked her if it were true. I could not have touched upon any imaginable subject more deeply interesting to my hearer, more than closely akin to her habitual train of thinking. She immediately threw off all restraint belonging to an interview with a stranger, and when she had received a few more similar proofs of my aptness for the marvelous, she went so far as to say that she would adopt me as her élève in occult science. For hours and hours this wondrous white woman poured forth her speech, for the most part concerning sacred and profane mysteries, but every now and then she would stay her lofty flight and swoop down upon the world again. Whenever this happened, I was interested in her conversation. She adverted more than once to the period of her lost sway amongst the Arabs, and mentioned some of the circumstances that aided her in obtaining influence with the wandering tribes. The Bedouin, so often engaged in irregular warfare, strains his eyes to the horizon in search of a coming enemy, just as habitually as the sailors keep his bright look out for a strange sail. In the absence of telescopes, a far-reaching sight is highly valued, and Lady Hester had this power. She told me that, on one occasion, when there was good reason to expect hostilities, a far-seeing Arab created great excitement in the camp by declaring that he could distinguish some moving objects upon the very farthest point within the reach of his eyes. Lady Hester was consulted, and she instantly assured her comrades in arms that there were indeed a number of horses within sight, but they were without riders. The assertion proved to be correct. From that time forth, her superiority over all others in respect of far sight remained undisputed. Lady Hester related to me this other anecdote of her Arab life. It was when the heroic qualities of an English woman were just beginning to be felt amongst the people of the desert, that she was marching one day along with the forces of the tribe to which she had allied herself. She perceived that preparations for an engagement were going on, and upon her making inquiry as to the cause, the sheik at first affected mystery and concealment, but at last confessed that war had been declared against his tribe on account of its alliance with the English princess, and that they were now unfortunately about to be attacked by a very superior force. He had made it appear that Lady Hester was sole cause of hostility betwixt his tribe and the impending enemy, and that his sacred duty of protecting the Englishwoman, whom he had admitted as his guest, was the only obstacle which prevented an amicable settlement of the dispute. The sheik hinted that his tribe was likely to sustain an almost overwhelming blow, but at the same time declared that no fear of the consequences, however terrible to him and his whole people, should induce him to dream of abandoning his illustrious guest. The heroine instantly took her part. It was not for her to be a source of danger to her friends, but rather to her enemies. So she resolved to turn away from the people, and trust for help to none, save only her haughty self. The sheiks affected to dissuade her from so rash a course, and fairly told her that although they, having been freed from her presence, would be able to make good terms for themselves, yet that there were no means of allaying the hostility felt towards her, and that the whole face of the desert would be swept by the horsemen of her enemies so carefully as to make her escape into other districts almost impossible. The brave woman was not to be moved by terrors, of this kind, and bidding farewell to the tribe which had been honored and protected her, she turned her horse's head and rode straight away, without friend or followers. Hours had elapsed, and for some time she had been alone in the center of the round horizon, when her quick eye perceived some horsemen in the distance. The party came nearer and nearer. Soon it was plain that they were making towards her, and presently some hundreds of Bedouins, fully armed, galloped up to her, ferociously shouting, and apparently intending to take her life at the instant with their pointed spears. Her face at the time was covered with the yashmak, according to the Eastern usage. But at a moment when the foremost of the horsemen had all but reached her with their spears, she stood up in her stirrups, withdrew the yashmak that veiled the terrors of her countenance, waved her arms slowly and disdainfully, and cried out with a loud voice, "Avaunt!" The horsemen recoiled from her glance, but not in terror. The threatening yells of the assailants were suddenly changed to loud shouts of joy and admiration at the bravery of the stately Englishwoman, and festive gunshots were fired on all sides around her honored head. The truth was that the party belonged to the tribe with which she had allied herself, and that the threatened attack, as well as the pretended apprehension of an engagement, had been contrived for the mere purpose of testing her courage. The day ended in a great feast prepared to do honor to the heroine, and from that time her power over the minds of the people grew rapidly. Lady Hester related this story with great spirit, and I recollect that she put up her yashmak for a moment, in order to give me a better idea of the effect which she produced by suddenly revealing the awfulness of her countenance. With respect to her then present mode of life, Lady Hester informed me that for her sin she had subjected herself during many years to severe penance, and that her self-denial had not been without its reward. Vain and false, says she, is all the pretended knowledge of the Europeans. Their doctors will tell you that drinking milk gives you yellowness to the complexion. Milk is my only food, and you see if my face be not white. Her abstinence from food intellectual was carried as far as her physical fasting. She never, she said, looked upon a book nor a newspaper, but trusted alone to the stars for her sublime knowledge. She usually passed the nights in communing with these heavenly teachers, and lay at rest during the daytime. She spoke with great contempt of the frivolity and benighted ignorance of the modern Europeans, and mentioned, in proof of this, that they were not only untaught in astrology, but were unacquainted with the common everyday phenomena produced by magic art. She spoke as if she would make me understand all sorcerer's spells were completely at her command, but that the exercise of such powers would be derogatory to her high rank in the heavenly kingdom. She said that the spell by which the face of an absent person is thrown upon a mirror was within the reach of the humblest and most contemptible magicians, but that the practice of such like arts was unholy as well as vulgar. She spoke of the bending twig by which, it is said, precious metals may be discovered. In relation to this, the prophetess told me a story rather against herself, and inconsistent with the notion of her being perfect in her science, but I think that she mentioned the facts as having happened before she attained to the great spiritual authority which she now aggregated. She told that vast treasures were known to exist in a situation which she mentioned, if I rightly remember, as being near Suez, that Napoleon, profanely brave, thrust his arm into the cave containing the coveted gold, and that instantly his flesh became palsied. But the youthful hero, for she had said he was great in his generation, was not to be thus daunted. He fell back characteristically upon his brazen resources and ordered up his artillery. Yet man could not strive with demons, and Napoleon was foiled. In latter years came Ibrahim Pasha, with heavy guns and wicked spells to boot, but the infernal guardians of the treasure were too strong for him. It was after this that Lady Hester passed by the spot. She described with animated gesture the force and energy with which the divining twig had suddenly leaped. In her hands she ordered excavation, and no demons opposed her enterprise. The vast chest in which the treasure had been deposited was at length discovered, but lo, and behold, it was full of pebbles. She said, however, that the times were approaching in which the hidden treasures of the earth would become available to those who had true knowledge. Speaking of Ibrahim Pasha, Lady Hester said he was a bold, bad man, and was possessed of some of those common and wicked magical arts, upon which she looked down with so much contempt. She said, for instance, that Ibrahim's life was charmed against balls and steel, and that after a battle he loosened the folds of his shawl and shook out the bullets like dust. It seems that the Saint Simeons once made overtures to Lady Hester. She told me that the Pierre Infantin, the chief of the sect, had sent her a service of plate, but that she had declined to receive it. She delivered a prediction as to the probability of the Saint Simeons finding the mystic mother, and this she did in a way which would amuse you, unfortunately. I am here not at liberty to mention this part of the woman's prophecies. Why, I cannot tell. But so it is, that she bound me to eternal secrecy. Lady Hester told me that since her residence at Jean, D-J-O-U-N, Joan, that she had been attacked by an illness so severe as to render her for a long time practically helpless. All her attendants fled and left her to perish. Whilst she lay thus alone and quite unable to rise, robbers came and carried away her property. She told me that they actually unroofed a great part of the building and employed engines with pulleys for the purpose of hoisting out such of her valuables as were too bulky to pass through the doors. It would seem that before this catastrophe, Lady Hester had been rich in the possessions of Eastern luxuries, for she told me that when the chiefs of the Ottoman force took refuge with her after the fall of Acre, they brought their wives also in great numbers to all of these. Lady Hester, as she said, presented magnificent dresses, but her generously occasioned strife only instead of gratitude for every woman who fancied her present less splendid than that of another, with equal or less pretension, became absolutely furious. All these audacious guests had now been got rid of, but the Albanian soldiers who had taken refuge with Lady Hester at the same time still remained under her protection. In truth, this half-ruined convent, guarded by the proud heart of an English gentlewoman, was the only one spot throughout all Syria and Palestine in which the will of Mehmet Ali and his fierce lieutenant was not the law. More than once had the Pasha of Egypt commanded that Ibrahim should have the Albanians delivered up to him, but this white woman of the mountain, grown classical not by books but by very pride, answered only with a disdainful invitation to come and take them. Whether it was that Ibrahim acted upon any superstitious dread of interfering with the prophetess, a notion not at all incompatible with her character as an able Oriental commander, or that he feared the ridicule of putting himself in collision with a gentlewoman. He certainly never ventured to attack the sanctuary, and certainly never ventured to attack the sanctuary, and so long as Chatham's granddaughter breathed a breath of life, there was always this one hillock, and that too in the midst of a most populous district, which stood out and kept its freedom. Mehmet Ali used to say, as I am told, that the Englishwoman had given him more trouble than all the insurgent people of Syria and Palestine. The prophetess announced to me that we were upon the eve of a stupendous convulsion, which would destroy the then recognized value of all property upon earth, and declaring that those only who should be in the East at the time of great change could hope for greatness in the new life that was then close at hand. She advised me, whilst there was yet time, to dispose of my property in poor, frail England, and gain a station in Asia. She told me that, after leaving her, I should go into Egypt, but that in a little while I should return into Syria. I secretly smiled at this last prophecy as a bad shot, because I had fully determined, after visiting the pyramids, to take ship from Alexandria for Greece. But men struggle vainly in the meshes of their own destiny. The unbelieved Cassandra was right after all. The plague came, and the necessity of avoiding the quarantine detention to which I should have been subjected if I had sailed from Alexandria forced me to alter my route. I went down into Egypt and stayed there for a time, and then crossed the desert once more and came back to the mountains of Lebanon, exactly as the prophetess has foretold. Lady Hester talked to me long and earnestly on the subject of religion, announcing that the Messiah was yet to come. She strived to impress me with the vanity and falseness of all European creeds, all well as with a sense of her own spiritual greatness. Throughout her conversation upon these high topics, she carefully insinuated, without actually asserting, her heavenly rank. Amongst other much more marvelous powers, the lady claimed one which most women have more or less, namely that of reading men's characters in their faces. She examined the line of my features very attentively and told me the result. This, however, I mean to keep hidden. One favored subject of discourse was that of race. Upon this, which she was very diffuse, and yet rather mysterious. She set great value upon ancient the ancient French, not Norman blood, for that she vilified, but professed to despise our English notion of an old family. She had a vast idea of the Cornish miners on on account of their race, and said if she chose, she could give me the means of rousing them to the most tremendous enthusiasm. Such are the topics on which the lady mainly conversed, but very often she would descend to more worldly chat, and then she was no longer the prophetess, but the sort of woman that you sometimes see, I am told, in London drawing rooms, cool, decisive, in manner, unsparing of enemies, full of audacious fun, and saying the downright things that the sheepish society around her is afraid to utter. I am told that Lady Hester was in her youth a capital mimic, and she showed me that not all the queenly dullness to which she had condemned herself, not all her fasting and solitude, had destroyed this terrible power. The first whom she crucified in my presence was poor Lord Byron. She had seen him, it appeared, I know not where, soon after his arrival in the East, and was vastly amused by his little affections. He had picked up a few sentences of the Romaic, and with these he affected to give orders to his Greek servant. In a ton de epime bomenos style. Ton d'epime bomenos style. Sorry, I can't say it, everybody. I can't tell whether Lady Hester's mimicry of the bard was at all close, but it was amusing. She attributed to him a curiosity, comical lisp. Another person whose style of speaking the lady took off very amazingly was one who would scarcely object to suffer by the side of Lord Byron. I mean the Lamartine. The peculiarity which attracted her ridicule was an over-refinement of manner. According to my lady's imitation of Lamartine, I have never seen him myself. He had none of the violent grimace of his countrymen, and not even their usual way of talking, but rather bore himself mincingly, like the humbler sort of English dandy. Lady Hester seems to have heartily despised everything approaching to exquisiteness. She told me, by and by, her opinion upon that subject is worth having, that a downright manner, amounting even to the brusqueness, is more effective than any other with the Oriental, and that amongst the English, of all ranks and all classes, there is no man so attractive to the Orientals, no man who can negotiate with them half so effectively as a good, honest, open-hearted, and positive naval officer of the old school. I have told you, I think, that Lady Hester could deal fiercely with those she hated. One man above all others, he is now uprooted from society. She blasted with her wrath. You would have thought that in the scornfulness of her nature, she must have sprung upon her foe with more of fierceness than of skill. But this was not so, for, with all the force and vehemence of her invective, she displayed a sober, patient, and minute attention to the details of Vitupration. Vituperation. Vituperation, which contributed to its success 1,000 times more than mere violence. During the hours of this sort of conversation, or rather discourse, was going on, our chibuques were from time to time replenished, and the lady, as well as I, continued to smoke with little or no intermission till the interview ended. I think that the fragrant fumes of the latakia must have helped to keep me on my good behavior as a patient disciple of the prophetess. It was not till after midnight that my visit for the evening came to an end. When I quitted my seat, the lady rose and stood up in the same formal attitude, almost that of a soldier in a state of tension, which she had assumed on my entrance, and at the same time she pushed the loose drapery from her lap, and let it fall down upon the floor. The next morning, after breakfast, I was visited by my lady's secretary, the only European, except the doctor, whom she retained in her household. This secretary, like the doctor, was Italian, but he preserved more signs of the European dress and European pretensions than his medical fellow-slave. He spoke little or no English, though he wrote it pretty well, having been formerly employed in a mercantile house connected with England. The poor fellow was in an unhappy state of mind. In order to make you understand the extent of his spiritual anxieties, I ought to have told you that the doctor, who had sunk into the complete Asiatic, had condescended accordingly to the performance of an even menial services, had adopted the common faith of all the neighboring people, and had become a firm and happy believer in the divine power of his mistress. Not so the secretary. When I had strolled with them such a distance from the building as rendered him safe from being overheard by human ears, he told me, in a hollow voice, trembling with emotion, that there were times in which he doubted the divinity of milady. I said nothing to encourage the poor fellow in his frightful state of skepticism, for I saw that, if indulged, it might end in the positive infidelity. Lady Hester, it seemed, had rather arbitrarily abridged the amusements of her secretary, and especially she had forbidden him from shooting small birds on the mountainside. This oppression had aroused in him a spirit of inquiry that might end fatally, perhaps for himself, perhaps for the religion of the place. The secretary told me that his mistress was strongly disliked by the surrounding people, and that she oppressed them a good deal by her exactions. I know not whether this statement had any truth in it, but whether it was or was not well founded. It is certain that in Eastern countries hate and veneration are very commonly felt for the same object, and the general belief in the superhuman power of this wonderful white lady, her resolute and imperious character, and above all, perhaps, her fierce Albanians, not backward to obey an order for the sacking of a village, inspired sincere respect amongst the surrounding inhabitants. Now the being respected amongst Orientals, it is not an empty or merely honorary distinction, but carries with it a clear right to take your neighbor's corn, his cattle, his eggs, and his honey, and almost anything that is his, except his wives. This law was acted upon by the Princess of Jorn, and her establishment was supplied by contributions apportioned amongst the nearest of the villages. And I understood that the Albanians, restrained, I suppose, by the dread of being delivered up to Ibrahim, had not given any very troublesome proofs of their unruly natures. The secretary told me that their rations, including a small allowance of coffee and tobacco, were served out to them with tolerable regularity. I asked the secretary how Lady Hester was off for horses, and said that I would take a look at the stable. The man did not raise any opposition to my proposal, and affected no mystery about the matter, but said that the only two steeds, which then belonged to Milady, were of a very humble sort. This answer, and a storm of rain then beginning to descend, prevented me, at the time, from undertaking my journey to the stables, and I don't know that I ever thought of the matter afterwards, until my return to England, when I saw the Lamartine's eye-witnessing account of the strange horse saddled, as he pretends, by the hands of his maker. When I returned to my room, this, as my hostess had told me, was the only one in the whole building that kept out the rain. Lady Hester sent to say that she would be glad to receive me again. I was rather surprised at this, for I had understood that she reposed during the day, and it was now a little later than noon. Really, said she, when I had taken my seat and my pipe, we were together for hours last night, and I still have heard nothing of all my old friends. Now do tell me something of your dear mother and her sister. I never knew your father. It was after I left Burton Peasant that your mother married. I began to make a slow answer, but my questioner soon went off again to topics more sublime, so that this second interview, though it lasted 2 or 3 hours, was all occupied by the same sort of varied discourse as which I have been describing. In the course of the afternoon, the captain of an English man of war arrived at Journe, and Lady Hester determined to receive him for the same reason as that which had induced her to allow my visit, namely, an early intimacy with his family. I and the new visitor, he was a pleasant, amusing man, dined together, and we were afterwards invited to the presence of my lady, and with her we sat smoking till midnight. The conversation turned chiefly, I think, upon magical science. I had determined to be off at an early hour the next morning, and so at the end of this interview I bade my lady farewell. With her parting words, she once more advised me to abandon Europe and seek my reward in the East, and she urged me to give the like counsels to my father, and tell him that she had said it. Lady Hester's unholy claim to supremacy in the spiritual kingdom was, no doubt, the suggestion of fierce and inordinate pride, most perilously akin to madness. But I am quite sure that the mind of the woman was too strong to be thoroughly overcome by even this potent feeling. I plainly saw that she was not an unhesitating follower of her own system, and I even fancied that I could distinguish the brief moments during which she contrived to believe in herself, from those long and less happy intervals in which her own reason was too strong for her. As for the lady's faith in astrology and magic science, you are not for a moment to suppose that this implied any aberration of intellect. She believed these things in common with those around her, and it could scarcely be otherwise, for she seldom spoke to anybody except crazy old dervishes, who at once received her alms and fostered her extravagances, and even when, as on the occasion of my visit, she was brought into contact with a person entertaining different notions, she still remained uncontradicted. This entourage and the habit of fasting from books and newspapers were quite enough to make her a facile recipient of any marvelous story. I think that in England we scarcely acknowledge to ourselves how much we owe to the wise and watchful press which presides over the formation of our opinions, and which brings about this splendid result, namely, that in matters of belief the humblest of us are lifted up to the level of the most sagacious, so that really a simple cornet in the blues is no more likely to entertain a foolish belief about ghosts or witchcraft or any other supernatural topic than the Lord High Chancellor or the intellectual regime, the Lord High Chancellor or the leader of the House of Commons. How different is the intellectual regime of Eastern countries. In Syria and Palestine and Egypt, you might as well dispute the efficacy of grass or grain as of magic. There is no controversy about the matter. The effect of this is the unanimous belief of an ignorant people upon the mind of a stranger that it is extremely curious and well worth noticing. A man coming freshly from Europe is at first proof against the nonsense with which he is assailed, but often it happens that after a little while the social atmosphere of Asia will begin to infect him, and if he has been unaccustomed to the cunning of offense by which reason prepares the means of guarding herself against fallacy, he will yield himself at last to the faith of those around him, and this he will do by sympathy, it would seem, rather than from conviction. I have been much interested in observing that the mere practical man, however skilful and shrewd in his own way, has not the kind of power that will enable him to resist the gradual impression made upon his mind by the common opinion of those whom he sees and hears from day to day, even amongst the English, though their good sense and sound religious knowledge would be likely to guard them from error. I have known the calculating merchant, the inquisitive traveler, and the post-captain, with his bright, wakeful eye of command. I have known all of these surrender themselves to the really magic-like influence of other people's minds. Their language, at first, is that they are staggered, leading you by that expression to suppose that they have been witnesses to some phenomenon, which it was very difficult to account for otherwise than by supernatural causes. But when I have questioned further, I have always found that these staggering wonders were not even spacious enough to be looked upon as good tricks. A man in England who gained his whole livelihood as a conjurer would soon be starved to death if he could perform no better miracles than those which are wrought with so much effect in Syria and Egypt. Sometimes, no doubt, a magician will make a good hit. Sir John once said a good thing, but all such successes range, of course, under the head of mere tentative miracles, as distinguished by the strong-brained Palad. So that was quite a wordy chapter, and lengthy as well. So, if you enjoyed this episode of Wicked Shizuku's reviews and this read of Eothen, I would really appreciate a like, subscribe, and share. And if you wish, leave a comment down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. I hope you have a good evening. Good night, everyone.